Hello, everybody. I hope you're doing well. So, we're at Lab 5 today, and Lab 5 is going to be on hypothesis testing. And I thought it would be important for me to start with an example before we jump into the material. So, without further ado, when I was traveling or taking time off from school, one of the places I visit was China. And during 2020, starting the pandemic, I was there throughout the duration of the early time and then all the way up until about August of that year. Then I came back to the States. And what I noticed was there was a difference between how people, at least in the city I was located in China, were adapting and adjusting to the pandemic. And when I came back to the United States, I saw a sharp contrast with what people were doing in Nanjing and what people were doing in Providence. And it's just kind of a interesting set of conditions. So we saw that there was, when I was there and a couple of my colleagues, we kind of observed that there wasn't any plexiglass in front of vendors when you go out and check out your goods. And when you entered into some places, they had like this scanner that would like scan to see if like you were like above a certain temperature. I forget the name of this apparatus right here, but it would scan your body sort of like temperature and just to see if you passed the sniff test, and if you did, then you could enter into their facility. And also, there was a standard mask enforcement in a lot of areas, and so it wasn't enough to have a face covering as you see here. You had to have a certain kind of mask, and it was usually these blue, standard masks that we find very, very common in the United States now. And the other thing was, I didn't see any KN95 mask. I saw it from time to time, but usually I saw just regular masks, regular standard masks that people wore. So that got me thinking about some things. And since we're on the topic of hypothesis testing, one of the things I was wondering, and just a general big picture question was, I wonder why people in certain areas are wearing more masks than in other areas. And that big question just kind of like has this sort of vague notion of what's going on in the world, or asks the vague question, what's going on in the world, and then from there, you can try to specify your question with more of a specific research question. So you create a formal question that will lead to research, and you have this sort of big picture question, and then you sort of whittle it down to a more specific research or general question. And the general question is in the form of a research question. And here's one research question that could be asked about masks in different countries. Will politics motivate people to wear masks? Well, that's a pretty valid thing in the United States, but it really can't be compared to China because as far as I was aware of, at least in the city of Nanjing, they didn't have the sort of political adversarial relationship that we do in the United States. The other thing was, does fear motivate people to make important decisions? I like this question, but I would like to go into more specifics, and let's see if we can dive deeper. Does fear motivate people to wear masks? Well, maybe that one is more pinpointing to what I would like to examine and do a study on. And so I choose this one, number 3, and from here, now I move on to step 2, which is creating a hypothesis, and more specifically, it's called a hypothesis statement. It's not really a question, but it's more of a statement. And in this hypothesis statement, you are really, really trying to get into the bottom of things and ask a question that could be specifically done in research. So how can I make this question into something I can test in an experiment? So that's what a hypothesis statement is all about, is formalize it in the sense that you make this declaration that this is how you are, in a general sense, going to perform your study. And in this case, the hypothesis statement is Americans exposed to something scary will use more hand sanitizer than other groups, or than the other group. And if I was to make this just a little bit more specific, I would say, well, Americans exposed to something scary will use more hand sanitizer than the other group, and maybe it would be something like exposed to a scary photograph of some sort. Not exposed to this photograph. And all right, so now I have a more specific hypothesis statement that I just made and something I can perform an experiment. So let's go ahead and move on. And so I have this question. Oops, I probably should not delete that just yet. And really I should just copy and paste this onto the area right here just so I have it. And just scratch it up just a little bit. So now that we have this hypothesis statement, it's a lot more specific. And what I am essentially doing is I'm testing two groups. A group exposed to a photograph and a group not exposed to a photograph. So there's two different groups with two different conditions. And so group one is participants are shown a scary picture. In group two, participants are not shown the scary picture. And there's not really necessarily two possibilities, but these are two groups. And later it's going to be two possibilities because we will have something that we will think about as considering as what will happen. And in this case, we have two possibilities of how this would end up. So if we separate these two groups, and let's say we have 40 participants receive a scary photograph, and then they're asked if they want to use hand sanitizer. And then you have 40 other students that do not receive any sort of scary photographs, and they're also asked to use use some hand sanitizer. And what happens is either this group one, that is exposed to something scary, use more hand sanitizer, or maybe they use less hand sanitizer. Or perhaps the other possibility is there's no differences between these groups. So in the very basic sense, what I'm saying is the first thing is the null hypothesis, H base O, and this is the population mean. And we're symbolically saying this because we're using samples. So we're saying our sample population mean representing the population, but in a sample form of group that does not receive the photograph will be equal to the group that does receive the photograph. And this should be really no scary photo. Just to make it more clear, I probably should write down no scary photo, and this should be scary photo. And of course, what I'll need to do is make this a little bit smaller so you guys can see it. All right. And I can do the same with this one right here. So we have the null, which is this is a symbol for null. So null as an N-U-L-L, hypothesis. That means there's no differences between groups. The no scary photo group will equal to scary photo group. And then the alternative hypothesis, one that we are testing and trying to see if our main hypothesis is valid, is that the scary photograph has different hand sanitizer use than the group that's not exposed to the scary photograph. And so essentially what I'm getting at is hypothesis testing. Here is some of the general sort of information from your walkthrough, and it's attached to the content section of the lab. So if you go to our section in the lab, we're in lab 5 right now, you will receive this information in the form of a Word file. What is a hypothesis testing? when we have a research question that needs to be answered, we first form a hypothesis based on what we think could be the answer. Then we collect the samples that is representative of the population of interest and collect data. With this data, we then run a series of inferential tests, which will either show support for our hypothesis or not. And so what I gave you was a version of a test that we could perform. And so there's other ways in which we can perform it, and it's in the form of like an independent t-test or one sample t-test or ANOVA and so on and so forth. And we'll go into more detail in later classes. Now, we talked about this research question, and then let me just read this just so you have it, you become more familiar with it, because this is what we looked at before. Null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. And in this case, what we have here is null hypothesis. I like to call this the negative Nancy hypothesis. The hypothesis says there will be not a significant difference between populations. In our case, we have two samples that represent populations. And there will be no relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Now, that sort of like asks the question, what is this independent variable and dependent variable? Well, the independent variable is a factor that is manipulated or controlled in the experiment study. So in our case, what we are manipulating is whether or not they are receiving a scary photograph. We can manipulate other things, and as you can see here, we're going to be manipulating whether or not somebody receives a brownie or not, and then test their artistic ability, the dependent variable. And that's the other thing, is the dependent variable is a factor that's being measured because of this difference, because of this manipulation or controlled element of the experiment. So because of the independent variable, we are measuring the dependent variable to see if there is, in our case, a difference between the groups. And so that is the null hypothesis. There's no relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable. There's, even if you have this manipulation in the form of an independent variable, it's not going to mean that you're going to have a difference in measurement outcomes between the two groups. There will not be more hand sanitizer in one group versus the other. And the alternate hypothesis is typically what you believe is going to happen and is the opposite of the null. This hypothesis indicates that you think there will be a significant difference between the populations, like above, a relationship between the independent and dependent variable. And I probably should also mention that this could also be a correlational study, and that's where these relationship elements come into play. And so if you have an experiment study, a true experiment, then you would have controls and constant positions and a cause-vector relationship. In a correlational study, there's more of a relationship between the variables, like a positive or negative relationship, as we talked before. But it cannot really tell you about cause or an effect. It can just say that there's a relationship between two variables. As one increases, maybe the other one increases. Now, in this example, this second example, I'm going to be testing whether or not creativity output can be manipulated by this variable right here, whether or not participants received a marijuana product. Now, here is our research question. Does marijuana improve creativity? And in our hypothesis statement, participants that use marijuana product will produce creative art than those, or more creative art than those that don't. So the independent variable, and this is something we'll talk about in our next session, because we're going to be coming to a close in this session, which is we have two levels of our independent variable. We have the no marijuana group and the marijuana group. Let's say if we were to increase this, we'd have the no marijuana group a group that receives water and a group that receives marijuana, then that would be 3 levels of the independent variable. All right, so let me continue this later. Thank you so much for listening.